February meeting. For the third consecutive year, we lost our January meeting, as you guys know, to weather. This time it was Cindy, which I think she's in the back. We lost Cindy's new birder presentation in January. She's going to deliver that in April. Okay, so that'd be great. Couple quick things that are fun. As many of you know, Malcolm and I have been working with Brian Johnson on some banding stuff, and we had the Melanerpe species in our yard, and the two around here are the red-headed woodpecker and the red-bellied woodpecker. And a few days after having the bird on the top right, red-headed woodpecker in Ottawa County, we went to Puerto Rico, and a few days later had the same genus in the Puerto Rican woodpecker, which is endemic to Puerto Rico. I know many of you have been to Puerto Rico. I think I was just talking to Daniel about that. Did you have that when you were down there?
Yes, actually, that was one of the endemics we did get.
Cool. So cool. Also, very interestingly, crested caracara not in Ottawa County, but in the state, as many of you guys know, more commonly found in Texas. We've got, and I think the only one left in its genus now, in the caracara genus. I think the other is the Guadalupe caracara went extinct recently. So that's only one Falconidae family, but most of our falcons are in that Falco genus. But we've got caracara, only one in its genus left. Lonnie Garris got a nice little picture there. I don't know if it's good. Yeah, look at that one. He got that picture. Gene Stoddard, another birder in Ottawa County, got that one. And then I don't know this person, Cassie Lee. Maybe some of you do. I thought this was a really nice picture. I know some of you went to see the bird. Cindy, did you get it?
No.
Lonnie did. I know Daniel did, right? Drove over there. Is that Chase? Did you go see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I figured, right? Cool. Awesome. So just remember that the programs are co-sponsored by Muskegon County Nature Club. Thanks to our host, Kevin's always been amazing here at Rallidae District Library, so thank you. Remember, it looks like we've got a lot of experienced folks here, but if you're not part of the club, make sure you get your dues in because it's a great club to be a part of. We're doing some really fun stuff. A few meetings ago, you guys may remember, you voted for some Purple Martin gourds, and there's 24 of them in my basement that we'll be putting up in the spring. You also voted for some tree swallow boxes. Malcolm and I, we've been working with Michael Lombardo to construct those, and Brian to make sure our design's good. And we've got a prototype, so we just have 19 more to build. So we need to get those up in the next month. So that's been all part of the work that you guys have obviously done, so thank you for that. Quick highlight from the newsletter. Our board member, Lonnie Garris, wrote a winter birding article, and I thought this was delightfully poetic, so just to read this paragraph. Again, he's writing about winter birding. Yet the greatest joy may simply be the peacefulness. Your warm layers create a cocoon of comfort, letting you linger longer in the silence. It's in these moments, boots crunching softly, fingers curled around binoculars, wool hat pulled low, that winter birding becomes more than a hobby. Becomes a reminder that beauty still thrives in the coldest seasons, waiting for anyone willing to step outside and look. Okay, so that's written by Lonnie Garris, and we asked him, and Michael usually writes the article for the newsletter, but we asked him to do this one, and he wants to do another one. So we're getting at Lonnie's creative side, I think. Many of you know Carl Manning. We did the Christmas bird count. He organizes the Hudsonville Christmas bird count, and he just sent, in the last month or so, he sent us some of the data for that. We had 29 counters and 15 parties in the Hudsonville count this year, 70 species, which is pretty typical. We had 78 last year. About 500 miles by car and about 15 by foot with 82 hours in the field. Highest count, almost 4,000 European starlings. Some highlights, Jess and Alex found a first ever for the CBC golden eagle in the count circle. Lucas Timmer had a yellow-rumped warbler. Malcolm and I had really a murder of crows just going wild. And it took us a few minutes to figure out what they were after, but it was a common raven, so that was fun. And the northern mockingbird, which we talked about, I think, in December in this meeting, still there. And Curtis and Mike found that one. Okay. So any other questions about the Christmas bird count, or if you want to participate in the future, obviously let us know. Upcoming field trip is February 21st at Pierre Marquette Park in Muskegon. I wasn't sure of the time. Is that
8:30?
8:30. And usually you guys meet kind of by the
By the deck?
deck restaurant, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. Don't forget about Bird City. Bruce has been taking the lead on that. So Bruce has an announcement about that, and then one other announcement. Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, so Bird City's a nationwide effort to get places designated. Grand Haven's already a Tree City, USA, and so we're going for Bird City, USA designation. One of the requirements for that is get a resolution from the city and the city council to pass that. The Tribune article said it was already designated, but that was a little bit premature, so I fussed at the editor, at the journal writer about that. And they wrote back and said, hey, we'll make the corrections up to the article. And then the editor of the Grand Haven Tribune, Matt DeYoung, asked if anybody would like to be interviewed about bald eagles. He wants to write an article about bald eagles because he saw one recently. He figured, they were showing up, and I figured they could stay here year round. But I don't know. So if anybody is an expert in bald eagles and would like to be interviewed for an article, please let me know, and I'll put you in touch with the editor of the Grand Haven Tribune, Matt DeYoung. Okay.
Thanks, Bruce. And Matt's written some really nice articles about birds in the past, which has been really, I think, enriching for the community. And we've got that nest near Otto Sands, right? The one kind of over by, help me out, guys, planks. Is that what's over there? The gravel and stuff.
The one on behind the fire station.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
I saw some.
Have you seen a nest here?
That I was over there. The nest is there, but I didn't see any birds. But
Okay.
Somebody had posted in the Grand Haven Informed Facebook page that they'd seen eagles building the net, working on the nest with sticks. So
Exciting. March 17th, guys, that's our next one. That's a Chimney Swift Conservation in Michigan meeting. That's going to be with Chad Machinsky, so that's an exciting one. Before we get to Daniel, we have a quick voice vote to do. Well, we'll see if it's quick. If it takes too much discussion, then we'll push it off to next time. But the board has been discussing this for a few years. We think that our May meeting is superfluous because that's simply the business meeting. And what the board would like to do, the board has already voted on this and passed it. What we'd like to do is eliminate the May meeting so that we can be out birding in May and doing the kind of surveys and scientific research that we do. And then instead have a program in April, and that will be our final meeting of the year, and then do the business meeting at the end of that program. So this year, for example, we would not lose a program. It would be this year Cindy would present in April, and then when Cindy's done presenting, we would handle any business. Okay. Again, the board has approved that, but it requires a change in the bylaws. So the bylaws would say the May meeting shall be known as the annual meeting, at which time election shall be held. That's current. We would change it to April. Okay. And the proposal is that we would amend the bylaws so that our final meeting of the season is April instead of May. Okay. In order to change the bylaws, we need a 2/3 majority vote of the members present. We talked a little bit about why the change, but if there's any questions about that, we can of course field them momentarily. And the way this works with Robert's Rules of Order is we start with a motion. The proposal is that the board proposes amending the bylaws so that our final meeting of the season is April instead of May. I have a motion on that.
so moved.
Thank you, Cindy. Can I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Malcolm. Any questions or discussion?
I had a little something. I hate to lose another meeting because I
Yeah.
have to meet everyone, and January very often is one that's not here. And now we're taking away another one we don't see all summer, and that's just a thought.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm not going to vote against it, however.
Yeah.
My discussion. How many people have attended the May meeting in the past couple of years?
Bonnie does, yeah. That was part, yeah.
It's typically, the May meeting has typically been a lot of, last year we've had more, and we haven't.
Bird swap.
Yeah, so we have had a few more. There were a couple of years where it was just the board members and maybe one or two other people, so.
And that's what started the discussion, is it was the board members, and that was a little frustrating.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, but at the same time, we want to provide substantive programming, obviously. So what we'd like to do is, like I said, not lose a presentation. But it's thank you, Bonnie.
We also talked about the possibility of having some other event that might be an outdoor event in May, to replace, not have a program, but maybe add a bird hike or have a potluck at a outdoor venue or something.
Yeah, if that helps, Bonnie, we're currently planning a May 9th event where we could go to Ottawa Sands and you guys could look at the eggs, and there probably won't be they won't be young at that point, but we want to set up opportunities for you guys to go and look at the stuff that you guys have funded. So we'd open the boxes for you so you could see tree swallow young, as the summer progresses in spring, and see the nesting purple martins. Any other discussion, questions? All current members of OAS may vote. That's lifetime and renewed membership. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Great, thank you. That is passed, and we'll get you guys an update on the bylaws moving forward. Okay, any recent sightings that are fun?
Yes.
Yes, please.
We had bluebirds in our backyard on the feeder February 5th,
Wow.
February 7th, and February 12th.
That's exciting.
So, yeah. Need to see
What type of feeder was it?
Just a, pole feeder with a, just your standard pole feeder.
Cool.
Yeah.
Bluebirds have really been hitting our suet.
Yeah, your suet.
Yeah.
I want to say Beth's using mealworms. Is that right?
It is live mealworms from Uncle Jim's worm farm.
I use
And
dried
it's
mealworms,
delightful.
and that's what brings my bluebirds in.
Okay, dried mealworms, suet for you guys.
We had suet too on our
Suet,
pole,
yeah.
so maybe that helped. Yeah.
Cool. Any other sightings you want to mention? Beth?
It was a treat not only to see the shrike, the northern shrike this week at the on Palm Drive at the very northern end of Ottawa County, but I heard him singing. Be still my heart. Yeah, which is pretty early. I mean, I've seen them in that field in April, so he's got a ways to go. I mean, some time.
Yeah, and thank you for seeing. Beth sent us a message, and we got on our bikes and rode over there.
Yeah,
So
that was a
we
treat.
got to see it for 6-7 seconds, which is usually pretty. We had a flyover killdeer today.
Oh
Which
wow.
is obviously on the early side. Red-winged blackbirds, you've got, Beth, right?
Yeah.
We had them at in Grand Haven today. Okay, great guys. Let's transition to just to quickly mention, we've got Daniel Goldberg from GVSU who will introduce, but he is currently the faculty sponsor for a birding club or a birding group at Grand Valley, which is really cool. But he's going to present today. Cindy will introduce him, and we'll dive in. Thanks, Cindy. Oh yeah, hey Greg.
Exciting. We came home
Oh
at
yeah.
8 o'clock the other evening. It was already dark. And just as we turned in to park the car in the garage, the headlights passed over the bird feeder pole, and there was a barred owl perched on the top. I think he was watching for the mice that eat the suet and the drippings underneath the feeder.
That's exciting.
Pretty hot run.
Thanks, Greg.
Daniel Goldberg from GVSU. He is in the biology department. Daniel is an assistant professor of biology at Grand Valley State University, a role that he began in fall 2024 after teaching biology for a year at Albion College. His research interests span both animal communication and comparative studies of behavioral ecology and the evolution of elaborate signals, which he pursued during his bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of California, Riverside, and during his PhD at Illinois State University. He has published research articles on dorsal fin-based courtship displays in freshwater live bear or fishes, parental carrying of offspring on their backs in water birds. I've yet to see a loon with baby loons on its back, and I want to. And vocal behavior and duetting in rails. At GVSU, he specializes in teaching ecology, environmental science, ornithology, and natural history of vertebrates. We are eager to hear about these elusive birds we encounter in Ottawa County, often only by hearing them.
Oh, thank you for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Pleased to be here at the Washtenaw Islands Audubon Club meeting. First, I already know some of you, so good to see you again, Bruce. Thanks for seeing this talk a second time. You were at my previous one at GVSU. And yeah, if any of you have young friends or, children who are attending GVSU and interested in birds, please tell them to seek out the Ornithology Club, for which I am the faculty advisor. But today I'm going to be telling you about some of my PhD research at Illinois State, in which I focus on looking at the family of rails and their vocal behavior. Got some very beautiful artwork to start you off from the book by Robert Ripley on rails from 1976, which still hold up pretty well. So I've got 3 projects that I'll tell you about, which I was able to publish in the Wilson Journal of Ornithology, the journal Waterbirds, and the third one, the Pièce de Résistance, was published in the journal Ornithology, formerly known as the Auk. So those are fun to talk about. So we are aware of the fact that animals communicate in a variety of different modalities, including the way I'm talking to you now, but all sound really is a pressure wave that's spread through a fluid medium, either water or air, sometimes through a solid substrate. And so animals are going to be using sound to communicate in a variety of ways to advertise everything from their own identity or the identity of potentially enemies in the vicinity. It can be used to broadcast ownership of a territory or signal intent of trying to attract a mate in courtship. And it can also be used for assisting in movement such as nocturnal flight calls made by migrant birds, which I'll return to. And the structures that animals use to produce sound, such as the swim bladders in these toadfishes, are going to constrain the type of sounds that animals can make, but animals are also constrained by the structures that they use to detect sound, such as external ears, like our pinnae, or even the same swim bladders of these toadfishes. So similar sounds in similar closely related species are likely to be inherited from a common ancestor, and we can actually study the evolution of these signals using family trees to look at the evolution of these signals. And so that's what I'll be telling you about today for my third and final study. So just as one example of how sound is affected by structures, we know that typically larger animals are capable of producing lower frequency sounds. Smaller animals are going to make higher frequency sounds. That is based on limitations and dimensions of their vocal apparatus. So, something like a small bird is going to be making some very high-pitched noises that some of us may or may not be able to hear, as opposed to something large like, say, cassowary that is going to produce a very low-frequency infrasound. But also, it's not just, the intended signalers that animal signals are going to be affected, or the intended receivers that signals are going to be affecting, because these signals are made to cause a change in the behavior of a receiver, but there may also be eavesdroppers, so unintended audiences, whether they are the same species or different species, either friends or foes. And so animals have varying ways of trying to avoid being overheard. For example, they may use referential alarm calls to refer to certain predators. For example, chickadees make more D notes at the end of their chickadee calls when they see a small bird-eating owl as opposed to a large owl. And there also may be calls such as the calls made by vervet monkeys that indicate a leopard or a snake or an eagle, which each requires avoidance strategy. Or even the seat alarm call made by yellow warblers if they see a brown-headed cowbird, which is their brood parasite, which is eavesdropped on by red-winged blackbirds. We also know that animals will make sounds often in unison at certain times of the day, such as the dawn or dusk choruses. These are times in which the air may be better for propagating sound, or predators may be less active. So it's a good time to be a part of this social network. And so I'm focusing on, for my studies, the rails as a group, because this is a group of birds that you may be familiar with, including things like gallinules, coots, also crakes, and the rails of different types. And these birds tend to be often very vocal in dense vegetation, so you're more likely to hear them in many cases, not see them. They also are often nocturnal and crepuscular, so they're active at dawn and dusk. And many species are actually declining, even across wide ranges, due to a combination of mostly habitat loss. Some of them are also hunted. And so because they're difficult to study visually, my goal was to try to see what I could uncover by studying their sounds. Also because many species are not well known in terms of lacking behavioral data. But one way in which you can study rails, at least historically, has been through trying to use call playback surveys, in which you broadcast the calls of different rails and try to listen for which species vocalize in response. But that can miss when you do this at dawn and dusk, times of the day in which rails are still active. So my equipment that I used for my first two studies was actually this lovely device. This is the Autonomous Recording Unit, or ARU, which is basically a computer with a set of stationary microphones that you attach to something in the environment and seal it up, and it records all of its background sounds over a certain period. It can last months, if you change out the batteries periodically. And the rails are really good for this type of study because they produce a lot of different sounds depending on the species. Everything from trills to clicks to high-pitched, cackling sounds. But it tends to be very little variation within species. These calls are innate. They are not learned like those of songbirds, hummingbirds, and parrots. And they tend to be rather constrained among close relatives sounding similar. Typically, the sexes produce identical calls, although there are some variations, which you will find even in duets. More on that later. And I know that this technology works because in addition to some previously published studies, I even did some proof of concept testing with some ARUs in Illinois, where I was able to find different times throughout the day, including night, that king rails were vocalizing in Illinois. And even I was able to determine the numbers of duets actually were made by Virginia rails over the course of spring in one of my studies. So you can see that they actually are effective at detecting rails at different times of the day. And so this kind of follows up with some classic studies of animal behavior that were done by the great Nico Tinbergen, who was a contemporary of Konrad Lorenz, shared the Nobel Prize with him. And so Nico Tinbergen was looking at what are the proximate, ultimate, contemporary, and historical drivers of animal behavior. How does it work in terms of what makes it operate? What is its survival function in terms of allowing animals to survive, to have offspring that can pass on their genes? How does it develop over the individual's lifetime and is, built up or, potentially even learned? And finally, how do behaviors appear over evolutionary time among close relatives? So for my study, the first two I'll be telling you about focus on the current utility of calling in one species in particular, the Sora. And then second, for my third and final study, I'll be showing you how this behavior of duetting has evolved across the whole family of rails. So let's get started then. First of two projects focusing on the Sora. And so, as I mentioned, calls can potentially attract an unwanted audience, but this can give benefits to the animals that are listening in because they may also learn that there is a predator nearby. So, even though predators themselves may be eager to cash in, like this fringed-lip bat, which will eat calling male Tungara frogs in the neotropics, some calls can be referential, indicating the type or extent of the danger. And if you are calling actually or listening for calls, if you're able to detect, a call through calling of another of your own species or a nearby other animal, you might be able to have more time you could spend on feeding, for example, than being vigilant yourself. So we know that animals react strongly upon hearing as well as seeing their predators. Here are some great examples of just how pugnacious red-winged blackbirds can be, attacking predators that, are much larger than they are. But for something like this tufted titmouse, if it's vocally advertising that there's a hawk nearby, that may make it kind of an easy target for the hawk to swoop down on and eat. So it might try to call at a frequency that the hawk cannot actually hear. They may actually stop singing altogether or make fewer calls if they hear a predator, and this can have a chilling effect long after the predator has even passed. But with rails, they don't actually show a lot of changes in their vocal behavior when they see a predator. They will do things like hide or run away. They might actually use this tail flicking behavior where they show the white rump, the undertail covert feathers. It's kind of like when white-tailed deer flash their tails when they're running away. It's thought to be an indicator to the predator that it's been seen. so the bird is not worth pursuing. But we don't really know how well they change their vocal behavior in response to predators that they hear. We know that they might make alarm calls when danger is threatening, but we don't know how they'll respond to hearing these calls. And so for this study, I actually used owls as a stimulus for a predatory call because we know that owls will eat different species of rails, and in other species, prey birds like wood thrushes, for example, will reduce their own calling rates or song rates when they hear owls. And so the owl that I chose to use for this study was the great horned owl because it is a predator with rails on its menu, and it also is known to call while hunting. So there is a chance that at night, rails may hear this predator. So I hypothesized that rails will recognize owls as a threat and will reduce their own calling rates after they hear the sounds of an owl, but that this will not be shown after hearing control broadcasts, a harmless bird. I did this study at the Lake Calumet region of northeastern Illinois at 3 wetlands, which have been restored from former industrial sites. And I had 1 to 2 experimental and controlled treatments at each of these, 10 in total. The marsh areas that I used are shown here actually in dark, squares here. And these are places where rails have been documented to have returned after the restoration. So I set up a Song Meter 4 ARU, or SM4, as I'll heretofore refer to them. Recording during the breeding season in April, where rails are abundant at Lake Calumet, making broadcasts with these Fox Pro game callers, which you can attach to a 12-volt battery and a pre-programmed timer and set up in a big Rubbermaid tub with some holes and mesh coverings for the sound to spread throughout the area. I used calls that I assembled in the online Raven Pro software with downloads from the Macaulay Library of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So for the experimental treatment, it was great horned owl hoots. My control was actually the quack of a blue-winged teal, which should be a non-threatening bird that the rails may be exposed to locally. And I did a broadcast sequence similar to owl calling, over the course of 10 p.m. to 12 a.m. with 6 times every 20 minutes on the halfway point, April 21st, which is when owls are vocally active. I then scanned the resulting recordings manually to identify rail calls in Raven Pro, which is faster than with automated detectors. And I actually identified rail calls from how they look when you see the sound. This shows you time on the x-axis and frequency on the frequency on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. Rail calls have distinct appearances. And I was able to calculate the vocal activity rate hourly for all the rails together and each species individually. But it turns out, actually, that the only rails that were really calling in this study were Soras and Virginia rails, and there were too few Virginia rails to analyze on their own, so I basically had them just lumped in the all rails group, which I also analyzed separately from Soras, with sight as a random effect. And that makes sense because these are 2 of the most common rails in North America, including at this study site. It turned out that calling rates went up as the breeding season progressed, and actually the changes in the call were dependent on the type of broadcast. So here's what this looks like. You can see that for both Soras only and for all rails combined, the number of calls that they were making per hour went up significantly after owl broadcasts, but actually declined after the teal broadcasts. So the control is shown in black, the experimental in orange. This was significant. So this did not support my prediction. They were not becoming more quieter after hearing the owl calls. They actually were more vocal. But for both of these calls I heard, the famous per weep or whinny calls of the Sora, or the grunt series made by Virginia rails, these seem to function as alarm calls. And so they also will make these calls in response to loud noises, but they were in a heightened state of vigilance after the owl broadcast. They may also be safe from owls in this dense vegetation, especially for great horned owls, which often use vision to hunt their prey. And finally, it turns out that they are actually not a big part of the diet of the great horned owl. They are mostly going to be those owls are mostly going to be taking American coots which are out on open water, easier for the owls to find. Not as many Soras or Virginia rails recorded in studies of owl diets at different locations. But it seemed like it was a worthwhile try. I mean, we don't really know what a lot of the predators of the Sora and Virginia rail are, actually. So that requires further study. But it did seem that these rails were not threatened into silence and that they kept vocalizing after owls were broadcast. This is one of the first studies to look at changes in nocturnal vocal behavior in rails. And, future studies could try to look at if these rails are out in the open and you broadcast calls of predators, how might they change their vocal behavior then? Will they show, the behaviors such as running away or hiding, or will they change their vocalizations? So on the subject of Soras at night, we can go into my second study, and that looked at nocturnal migration of this species in central Illinois. So we know that, especially as we're getting into spring and birds are on the move, maybe some of you are already hearing at night birds making nocturnal vocalizations. They actually can rely on calls that they hear from below, or songs even, to determine where to settle for the night. That may indicate a good habitat where there is food, potential mates available. We're not exactly sure how, though, they use these vocal cues at night, or rather how they use visual cues at night. We know they're listening for other birds, but whether visual cues are a factor in determining stopovers, that has remained elusive. But we do know that visual cues by day can attract birds and have been used successfully to bring birds back to areas where they have been extirpated. So, for example, Egg Rock off the coast of Maine, there's been a successful Atlantic puffin reintroduction program with broadcasting puffin calls and putting up these cute wooden puffin decoys. They think that there are puffins there. They have returned in numbers. So decoys can indicate breeding activity to these birds. I guess they don't see the post here that's holding it up. But this has mostly been done in studies of songbirds and colonial seabirds, actually, not the birds I'm interested in. And we think that migrants may potentially select visual cues when making landfall, but it's not exactly clear what visual cues they might use. Is it based on vegetation or maybe water bodies present? But this warrants looking at what may drive nocturnal settlement as well. So rails are a group of birds that will actually migrate at night, and they're also known to call at night while they're migrating. There are some examples of a Virginia rail and a yellow rail caught at night. This was from my colleague Ariel Fournier, who manages the Forbes Biological Station in central Illinois. And Soras also are one of these nocturnal migrant rail species. They are abundant in the spring and also a resident in Illinois. They make distinctive calls during migration. And they're known to select wetlands as breeding sites along the way. So you can find them in shallow water where there's emergent vegetation. We know from call playback surveys that they will vocalize in response to hearing other Sora calls. And they've even been found in wetlands and agricultural areas, which was great for me because it allowed me to set up a controlled experiment. So for this study, I hypothesized that Soras can be attracted to fields where they hear the calls of other Soras broadcast, or where they see visual cues, such as ponds, or where there's the combination of both, which could indicate good places to stop over during their migration. But I predicted that the biggest response would actually be at sites that had both a pond and broadcasts, rather than either variable alone, or neither of them at all. I used 3 central Illinois farms for this study, one of which was owned by Illinois State, the others including Nature Conservancy-owned Franklin Farm and the private Moga Aerosmith Farm. These had 4 treatments per farm, with 1 of each treatment, as I'll show you coming up. The vegetation was all similar, actually, whether there were ponds or not. And I set up an ARU at each site, recording from mid-April to early June, when Soras are typically moving through central Illinois and they're vocally active. Here's what it looks like from the air. These are maps from McLean County GIS. You can see Franklin Farm up here, Moga Farm down here, and University Farm here. Each of the yellow stars represents where an ARU was set up. So I've got all the bases covered at each farm. This one was actually on private property that the landowner kindly let me use for lack of the last site at university farm. But you can see that at the control sites, I just had the ARU set up to listen, but I also had them set up around ponds near broadcasts from the game callers of Sora calls, and finally with a combination of both a pond and a game caller. The game callers again were using these Fox Pros with digital timers and car batteries attached, which would start remotely and play at the top of every hour from sunset to sunrise. The sequences were mimicking natural Sora calling rates, and I had a combination of the typical per weep and whinny call. Has anyone here not heard the calls of the Sora? A couple of you, all right. Well, I will pull out Merlin actually, and I will let you all hear what these cute little birds sound like. They're pretty distinctive. There we go. This is the per weep call. And this is their whinny call. So those are quite distinctive. You know, they travel well, so should hopefully lure in some birds. And again, once I got the recordings, I manually scanned the results in Raven Pro to identify Sora calls. And here I calculated a daily vocal activity rate. Again, analyzing these statistically afterward. Turned out that 8 of these ARUs only found just a couple of Soras over the entire study period. Maybe 1 to 3 in total, not many passing through sites. That's difficult to work with, very little data. But I found 4 sites, 3 of which were at Franklin Farm, actually, that had many Soras detected. So there was not a significant effect of the cue treatment on the calling rate. If you look here, you can see that for pond only, playback only, neither or both, not really any major differences in calls per day. This is not statistically significant, but it was a fairly small sample size with just 3 farms, 1 site of each type at each farm. However, when I looked at site as a variable, it turns out that there was a massive difference when you looked at Franklin Farm compared to the other 2 farms. And this actually makes sense because Franklin Farm is a restored wetland operated by the Nature Conservancy. It's a place where Soras have been known to breed in the past, and actually suggesting that they were breeding again. Their calls peaked from late April to mid-May, which is part of the breeding season in central Illinois. When I looked at the whole season, going from April 11th through May 31st, you can see that Franklin 2, shown here with the thicker, hat dashed lines, had the most Soras calling throughout the spring, actually, even more so than the other Franklin sites. And when we looked at all of these Franklin sites, you can see that Soras had peaks of calling around 8 to 10 p.m. and then 5 to 8 a.m., which actually are times that match what call playback surveys have found done, at dawn or dusk. So I found the Soras all 3 of these sites, even though they didn't show higher activity where there were both ponds and broadcasts. So these were probably just temporary stopovers during migration, but they will breed in wetlands of the size that I looked at. So that part seemed to be not a deterrent to them. They are also known to be calling throughout the night, and I observed this with the recordings as well. The peak of calling in April-May is when most Soras are migrating through central Illinois, but then they're less likely to be heard because at that point they've started to pair. The males are no longer calling to attract females, singing if you will, and they begin nesting actually. And so I did find that Soras will nocturnally migrate through these central Illinois farms and can be detected and can come into places where you do these broadcasts or the ponds, but it's most strongly associated with site fidelity, especially as Franklin Farm demonstrated. So, ideally, if you have restored wetlands, maybe you can bring in Soras with some broadcasts too, but seems that, if you want to try to boost populations, you probably need a habitat where they may have been seen in the past. Kind of raises the question, from Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. At least that's the hope. So last but not least, I will share with you what I found about duetting in rails. And this was the biggest project of my PhD, encompassing the whole family. It may surprise you, actually, but in many species, female birds will actually be just as vocally active as males. And we can see this whether it's, paired displays, but mutually done by pairs of albatrosses. We can get whole choruses of males and females together, like these bee eaters. And actually, one of my colleagues, Karen Odom, discovered in her research that female song is actually ancestral in the passerines. So something that you've seen transitions away from in certain lineages, like many of our temperate zone birds, where only the males sing. But we often also get males and females singing tightly coordinated songs or making calls in unison. We call these duets. So it can be one mated pair or a chorus of mated pairs. They can be totally or partially overlapping, so simultaneous or synchronous, asynchronous, or you can have a back and forth, what's called an antiphonal duet, where they can be so tightly coordinated with male and female contributions that they sound like a single bird. Either the male or the female can initiate this, and there may be sex-specific contributions. Here's an example where the male is shown in black, the female is in white. The female starts off with a series of notes, the male adds in his contribution, and then the female is back with her own again. Hypotheses for why birds duet cover multiple possibilities. It may be that they're defending a joint resource such as their breeding territory together, or a feeding territory other times of the year. It may be used to strengthen their pair bond as a signal of commitment. They can use it to maintain contact. If one member gets separated, the other can call to them, and if they're joined in a duet, they can find each other again. They may be using duets to maintain reproductive synchrony, that, they're going to want to breed at the same time. It may be used by a mate to protect the other bird. So if you have, for example, other males in the vicinity, a male may start to duet with the female to indicate to those floater males that this is his female. But it seems that the best supported function across a variety of birds, everything from songbirds to these cranes, is that they are defending their territories with duets, actually. It was originally thought, based on surveys of birds that do duet, duetting was thought, at least in the 1800s and early 1900s, to be just found in tropical birds. We now know that this is no longer the case. You can find duetting species worldwide, even if they are clustered more in the tropics. They also tend to be associated with a lack of migration, males and females looking similar in terms of their plumage coloration, defending territories year-round. Some species even have cooperative breeding associated with duetting, and stable long-term pair bonds. And going back to the idea of mate contact for duets, one proposal for a couple of studies of songbirds suggested that duets are actually used for pairs to stay in contact if they can't see each other well in dense vegetation, as a short-range signal, because songs and calls can actually travel differently in very closed habitats compared to open habitats. This is falling under what's called the acoustic adaptation hypothesis, the idea that there is selection on calls for optimal transmission in a species' native habitat. So if we look at closed versus open habitats, in closed habitats, you'll expect calls to last longer, to travel farther, that they may have lower frequencies and be at a narrow range of frequencies or a lower bandwidth. And so even though there's some bird species have been observed to have calls that do fit this pattern, it's a mixed bag, and there's no evidence of being universal in birds or even in other animals. But rails are an ideal test subject both for investigating the duets and also the acoustic adaptation. We know that rails include many tropical species, but they're also found worldwide. Many species do tend to have similar plumage of males and females. Some may actually have larger males. And rails vary widely in whether they are migratory, whether they have short or long-term pair bonds, whether they show cooperative breeding or just biparental care, and whether they defend territories seasonally or year-round. We also know that rails are found in a wide variety of habitats. They don't just occur in wetlands, which is where many species can be found here. You can have rails that live in grasslands, shrublands, forests even. And there's only been one previous study before mine that looked at testing the testing the acoustic adaptation hypothesis to rails. Here's an example, by the way, of one of these sexually dimorphic rails. This is the watercock of Indonesia. Here you can see that the male actually has this very gallinal or moorhen-like appearance, but kind of a little bony knob at the top of his beak. Females are going to be browner, kind of like this young purple gallinule, actually. And finally, rails are a great subject to test duetting in birds because if you look at songbirds alone, about 20% of species have been recorded and described to duets. For non-songbirds, it is a little bit more than that. So maybe 20% here, 18% here. But rails, about 45% of species have been documented in the literature or anecdotally as duetting. So twice as many as these other groups of birds. So I hypothesize that rail duets have evolved to under similar evolutionary pressures as in other groups of birds, that you will find these in forests or maybe heterogeneous habitats versus open habitats, that rails that duet would have less sexual size dimorphism than those that don't duet at all, and that duetting rails would not migrate, have long-term pair bonds, and defend their territories year-round. And that they would be occurring mostly in those tropical latitudes, consistent with other duetting birds. I also hypothesized that rail duets would fit the predictions of the acoustic adaptation hypothesis, such as that they'd be at lower frequencies, be longer calls at narrower bandwidths in forests, and that these traits would be seen more often in duetting species than in non-duetting species. I obtained my data using a recent family tree, or phylogeny, of the rail family, covering 89 of the 158 living species. I obtained measures of the call properties using a variety of sound databases like Macaulay Library, Xeno-Canto, measured in Raven Pro. I obtained information on their life history traits from Birds of the World, again another Cornell Lab of Ornithology database. A variety of studies in the published literature, and even looking at Google Earth, I was able to obtain the average breeding latitude from, taking the northern and southernmost ranges of their maps shown here, and even group them into different realms of the world based on a previous study looking at different regions. Although it turns out actually that rails are not typically found. There are relatively few living species in Oceania, actually, and none in Antarctica. I then did what is called a phylogenetic principal component analysis, in which you can actually look at several principal components showing you distinct clusters of these traits for the call properties that I measured. And so it turns out actually that you can see that there is a principal component here where the frequency variables I measured grouped together, that call length actually was its own separate trajectory, and finally bandwidth grouped together, as you can see here. So you can see that there was a strong, you can see that for the first principal component that it was related to frequency variables strongly. Principal component 2 was related to this call length, and finally principal component 3 was strongly related to bandwidth variables. Here is the tree of the 89 species of rails in my study, and so in case you're wondering what you're looking at, I have each of these nodes representing a common ancestor and all the living groups of living species of rails shown with these little pie charts, and how much red versus blue indicates, the probability that that species duets. So duets are present in the species shown in red, duets are absent in the species shown in blue. And this tells you actually that there are many lineages of rails that are dominated by duetting species. They are common in the South American small lateralis crakes, which is the group that includes the black rail. They are common in the Hypotenidea rails of Southeast Asia, including the rare Guam rail. They are found in the typical rails of the genus Rallidae, including the Virginia rail, king rail, clapper rail. Found in the South American wood rails of the genus Aramides, And finally, the Southeast Asian water hen and bush hens of the genus Amarylornis. When I did some phylogenetic MANOVAs, so an analysis of variance here, looking at habitat compared to these principal components, there was an effect of habitat on these acoustic variables when I accounted for common ancestry, but without it, it turns out that rails do make lower frequency calls in open habitats, shorter calls in forests, and narrower bandwidths in open habitats. But these p-values here, they're well above 0.05, which is typically the cutoff point for significance. So there is a trend, but not significant. On the other hand, there was a very significant effect of duetting on the acoustic variables when I applied common ancestry, but it turns out that duetting species call at higher frequencies when you don't consider common ancestry, and that duetting species make shorter calls and wider bandwidth calls. Again, though, you can see that these are not significant when you didn't account for common ancestry. For the life history traits compared to duetting, there was actually a mix of results. The strongest predictors of duetting were actually year-round territory defense, as you can see here, and habitat type. So rails that inhabit forests and heterogeneous habitats are much more likely to duet than rails in open habitats. For migration, there was a trend here which shows that rails that are sedentary and don't migrate do include more duetting species, but this was not quite significant, and there was no link at all between the length of the social bond or the type of breeding system, biparental versus cooperative, for rail duets. Likewise, there was no effect of breeding latitude on the incidence of duetting in rails. You can find duetting rails in, high northern latitudes, very southern latitudes, and around the equator, everything in between. Duetting is shown with pink having it, light blue lacking it. And actually, there are relatively few rails where males are substantially larger than females. So, turns out that there's no link between duetting and sexual size dimorphism either. So, what this tells us is that duetting is actually an ancestral trait in rails. And this makes sense if you know about their relatives in the order Gruiformes. All 15 species of cranes duet, the limpkin duets, the 3 species of South American trumpeter duet, the sungrebe and some species of flufftails duet. So it seems to be something that the rails would naturally have in their common ancestor. They also do not show some of the same relationships to life history variables as seen in other duetting birds, like social bond length or cooperative breeding, not tropical breeding latitudes either, or no link with sexual size dimorphism. Rail duets do not totally predict or fit the predictions of the acoustic adaptation hypothesis. We do find duetting species mostly in forests and heterogeneous environments where short-range signals would be a good way to stay in contact, but there's limited support for, this acoustic adaptation hypothesis. Perhaps the fact that there are lower frequency calls made in the open, these rails may be using that as a signal of larger body size. Higher frequencies may actually be done by these ground-dwelling forest rails to avoid being found by eavesdropping predatory mammals, which may not be as good at hearing higher frequencies in many terrestrial species. And finally, we think that because rails actually have innate calls that are not learned, they may be less plastic or adaptable to habitat traits due to the innate nature of their calls. But this is still an important finding because it's adding to our knowledge of rail vocalizations. There have been a lot of anecdotal reports of rails duetting, but not really any large comprehensive studies. Only a few species have actually been examined with direct experimental manipulation to test the function of duets. One such example is the white-throated rail of Madagascar and the Seychelles, which is a duetting species. That's probably the best known example. There have been a few studies to date, but actually a lot of studies observations have been made that yes, these species duet, not much else was known about it. But even research has found in the last few years that some species of rails that were not thought to duet actually will duet. Some examples of this include the oscillated crake of South America and the king rail. This was a comprehensive study done by my colleague Katie Schrader back at East Carolina University. Furthermore, we can look at studies of rails and see how, in the future, whether calls of duetting species actually do transmit less far than those of non-duetting species, which would suggest that these are short-range signals. The previous study I already alluded to of testing the acoustic adaptation hypothesis in rails looked at the corncrake, which is a European species that lives in open grasslands and does not duet. It does indeed make calls that transmit farther than those of the duetting water rail and spotted crake, which are found in more heterogeneous habitats. And rails are also good model systems for studying duets because we know that certain lineages are mostly or entirely composed of duetting species. We think that, because they have calls that are not learned, they might have a distinct development compared to duets of songbirds. And, unlike in songbirds, where some studies have even looked at the brain activity of male and female pairs duetting, rails could be examined for that. I did also find in my study that there are a few species of island-dwelling rails that will duet, which their mainland relatives do not. You see this actually in one type of moorhen from Gough Island in the South Atlantic. You also find duetting in the takahe, the largest living rail of New Zealand, which is basically a giant swamp hen found in New Zealand. But there's no duetting among the coots, for example. Many mysteries still remain. So in conclusion, do rails reduce their vocalization rates after hearing calls of predators? No. Soras will increase their vocal rates after hearing the calls of owls. Do rails settle in habitats at night where they hear broadcasts of their own species or see visual cues? Yes, but it seems that for Soras at least, a greater indicator of a good quality habitat would be sites where they've been breeding in previous years. And finally, do rail duets seem to match life history traits that other groups of birds show in association with duetting? To a certain degree. Territoriality and habitat type are significantly related to the presence of duetting, but not the other variables that are known to be related to duets in songbirds, for example. Another big takeaway here is that all of my research was made possible by using these technological advances, whether it was game callers to broadcast rail sounds, autonomous recording units to listen for these rail responses, acoustic analysis software to visually identify rail calls among background noise and other birds, and finally, all this wouldn't be possible without sound archives to actually compare the properties of calls and to make the broadcasts that I would use to test wild rail responses. We also know that there's a lot to be found still about rails. Many species are still poorly known. Some species have not even been recorded in terms of their vocalizations. And many species face a variety of threats, such as habitat loss, hunting, and even introduced predators on islands. This includes some flightless species, like this Auckland Island rail found south of New Zealand. So perhaps by studying rail duets, this can provide some additional knowledge into this declining but quite charismatic group of birds to ensure their protection for the future. So I think that's the Nike slogan, right? Just duet. We can leave it at that. But I'd like to thank the members of my PhD committee at Illinois State and the members of the Caparella Lab. I'd also like to thank my funding sources, which I obtained from several small Central Illinois ornithological societies, not unlike this one, actually, and a grant from Illinois State. And thank you very much for watching. I'd be happy to take any questions.
If there are questions, please repeat the question before the answer, Daniel, for the viewers at home.
Of course.
Just one more.
Yes.
When you talk about innate versus learned songs, how do you know that it's innate? I mean, do you isolate baby birds so they don't hear any other? Would they not sing?
Well, so that's a good question. So studies of captivity have found, yes, that they do not need tutors to actually learn songs. the question is how do you know whether rail songs are innate or not? Do you isolate birds? And it turns out actually that for parrots, hummingbirds, and songbirds, research looking at, development, youngsters have found that they do actually need to listen to adult tutors of their own species, and then they will practice. It's kind of like babies babbling to try, young kids learning how to talk, but then they will crystallize an adult song that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. But rails actually don't seem to do that. Studies of rails in captivity have found that they will just be calling on their own. They don't need to learn these calls from others of their own species.
So is there less regional variability between the innate calls?
The question was whether there's less regional variability between innate versus learned calls. And actually, yes. There have been a lot of studies on this in rails, but at least some studies looking at the, where is it? The corncrake in Europe have found that there is slight variance in the tempo or the timing between their calls. They make this two-note call, which has even given them their Latin name. It sounds like and there's variation in how widely they space out those calls in different places in Europe. But otherwise, yes, you don't get distinct dialects with slight differences in song in rails like you do in songbirds. So, like one good example of the dialect would be in the white-throated sparrow, where they sing, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." There's one region in Canada where the song has been shortened to "Oh, sweet Canna, Canna, Canna," and it's spreading. So you don't see that type of thing in rails. Bruce.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about this? How you analyze the hours and hours or weeks of recording? So these recorders are gathering information. They're capturing all sounds coming in. How does that software pick out the rail calls?
Right. So actually, if you want to use, the question was, how does software pick up the rail calls from all the hours of sound data that I was analyzing? I was actually looking for the appearance of the call. So if we go back, let me jump to a previous slide to show you what this looks like. If we go to the visual appearance of the call, here is in black and white here in Raven Pro. This is what the whinny call looks like after several per weeps. So if you just want to look at the sequence of the calls, you can actually identify them just by sight, which is faster than trying to use automated detectors, which may return a lot of false positives. So as one example, this per week call can actually be confused with spring peeper calls, for example, if you try to use automated detectors. So for my purposes, if I were using, many more ARUs for like months on end across a wide range or a wide geographic area, machine learning has gotten better at identifying calls, but we didn't have those resources available. So for one person with a bunch of maybe 10 to 12 ARUs, this was the fastest approach.
So you did it visually. You were scrolling through hours and hours of
Yes.
recordings.
It's faster than you think. Although I would prefer not to do it again. Yes.
Correlation between sight fidelity and age or sex?
Oh, that's a good question. Is there a correlation between sight fidelity and age and sex? The fact is I don't know what that's like at Franklin Farm. I was not actually visually able to see these Soras, so I'd have to talk to maybe some of the people who work there if they were able to capture the birds. Do they find banded birds that keep returning to the same site every year? You can tell if they're males or females if you sex them using some, distinct markings, like if the female has, a brood patch, for example. Actually, I'm not positive rails have a brood patch quite like songbird, but there are ways you can tell the sexes apart. Male Soras, for example, have a slightly yellower beak. So you probably could do that type of comparison, but I didn't have any information on it. Thank you. Yes.
So I'm curious what you think about this. You're saying that within the order growth formings, you've got the family Rallidae, for example, where you have the genus Rallus, there's quite a few duets.
Oh, yes.
And then you've got Druidae with your cranes that has quite a few duets. But then within Rallus, you've got Soras, which are the Porzana genus, right?
Yes.
That don't duet?
Actually, Soras do duets,
Okay.
along with their relative,
That crate.
the
that, right.
in Europe, the what's now? Is it striped crake? I believe Porzana. Yes.
And then you've
So
got
where are they on this tree? Where are they? Here they are. So that's red.
Mhm.
So that indicates they have duets.
And then you've got like the Limkin, that you're saying duets, right?
Right. The Limpkin's not actually on this tree. This is all
Right.
rails, but they're weird. You know, the question
Right,
was,
so the-
do other members of Gruiformes the order duet? You know, like cranes. You know, so the Limkin does, but the Limkin doesn't have any close relatives in its genus that are alive today. So
But it would seem that the gallinules and the coots are actually closer to the rails than the rails are to the cranes.
correct, they're nestled within the same family of
Right.
Rallidae.
So do you think that we're going to discover that there's more of this duetting in these families than we currently think?
So the new question is, will there be more discoveries of duetting in this family than we already think? Well, I'll be honest with you that there are some high altitude coots in South America, like the horned coot and the giant coot, that are not really very well studied vocally, especially the horned coot. Although the giant coot is actually on here. That one's better known. That one has not so far been found in duets. But it's not out of the realm of possibility that isolated populations of coots may potentially duet. And I only say that because here's the takahe, Porphyrio hochsteteri, that's among the swamp hens, you know, which also include the purple gallinule, you know, the bluish purple ones. Here is the Goff moorhen, Gallinula comeri, among the moorhens and gallinules. This is Tribonyx mortieri, that's the Tasmanian native hen, that's basically a large flightless moorhen of Australia. So it's possible, but, you know, we would just need more data on some of the poorly known rails that aren't on this tree. And sadly, you know, a lot of rails are now extinct. So, you know, maybe those species that are gone now did duet in the past, but we don't have any information on that. You know, rails are surprisingly good at colonizing distant islands, even though they may appear to be poor flyers. But they can be, you know, actually quite effective at dispersing over long distances. Yes?
Do you have any research ongoing right now or something that you're planning to continue in this area, or are you branching off into fin-based research?
Oh, so you're asking about, you know, my question was, do I have any more research on rails in the pipeline, or am I focusing more on like fin-based? Well, I do have a long-standing collaboration still with my master's advisor on live bearers that's stuck in development hell right now. We've been working on this project for 6 years, but with 2 co-authors at three other co-authors, same with me at different sites, it can be difficult to all come to a consensus on the draft. We're still trying to get all agreement on the draft to submit to a journal, the American Naturalist. But I will tell you that I'm working on another publication currently with Karen Odom herself, whose paper in Nature described female duets as female song as ancestral and passerines. So she and another colleague and I are trying to publish a paper on duetting in owls, actually, in the Journal of Rapture Research. And that's a study I worked on with an Albion student who gave a poster a couple of years ago. And in owls, too, territoriality is one of the strongest predictors of this behavior. They also show an effect of living in densely to moderately vegetated habitats is associated with duetting. And there I tried to look at whether nocturnal behavior, you know, because duets are good at propagating at night, whether that is related to duetting, but it's hard to disentangle that because they both seem to be ancestral in owls, and there have been few transitions to daytime or crepuscular activity in owls. You know, there's just a handful that do that, right? The northern hawk owl, the snowy owl, the short-eared owl, burrowing owl, you know, some of the pygmy owls. So that's the closest thing. You know, I still love rails. I grew to love them over doing these studies, but I'm not really working with them right now. But I have this experience with autonomous recording units and, you know, sound analysis software. So my goal after my 3-year position at GVCU, you know, I'm considering applying, or I'm going to apply for a postdoc at MSU where I might be able to do some more of this type of research, maybe just not with rails. So we'll just see what happens. Yes.
I wonder if you can comment on a phenomena that I hear at night. We have a pair of owls that duet constantly, but once in a while, and this happened 2 nights ago, there's a third owl that you can hear also, and I swear there was a fourth.
So
what's
yes, so that's a very
happening?
good question. How do you explain, the question is, how do you explain 3 or 4 owls duetting at once?
Yeah.
Well, you know, there are some rails that actually will show choruses of family groups where you have a male and a female duetting, but their offspring may join them at the same time. Like the black crake of Africa actually does this. In owls, I don't know of any examples like the one you talked about, but we'll go back to the cranes. There's a crane in Southeast Asia and Australia called the Soras crane, where there was a study that documented the young of the full-grown offspring of a mated pair joining them in a triad, it was called. So it could be that this pair has some adult young from previous years that are joining in, or maybe it's just, you know, a chorus of neighbors, perhaps. But owls are weird. I've found some papers that have documented owls starting to duet, joined in by the howls of a wolf, or even the sounds of a fox, or feral dogs. So, you know, you get weird back and forth sometimes going on. A lot remains unknown about this behavior.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Has there been a lot of study on using automatic vocalization to control population?
So the question is, have there been studies of using, when you said automatic, I assume you mean automated?
Yeah.
Automated, you know, like broadcasts to control populations. So yes, actually, you know, there have been attempts to try to scare birds away from places using predator sounds. Like I think at airports, people have tried to do that. You know, similar. It's kind of the opposite of trying to lure them in with, you know, bringing birds to an area with the calls of their own species. So I'm trying to think of some other examples. Like the sounds of hawks potentially may be used as a deterrent, I think. So yes, it has been done, maybe not as often, but, you know, birds, you know, there may be different things that could deter them from an area. You know, they're pretty smart, right? So they can't be fooled. Oh, you know, some of them may not be fooled for long with those.
I was actually thinking about, you were talking about areas that had kind of gotten repopulated after they'd been depopulated because of the calls of the species of the rails that were there. And I just wondered if you could do that to restore population in areas.
I wouldn't see why not. I mean, you know, I wouldn't necessarily broadcast owls to try to bring rails back, but certainly other rails, yes.
Blackbirds, maybe.
Potentially, yes.
Oh, there's an owl around that island, syntax.
Right. I mean, you will see, you know, birds scatter. Actually, a good example of, you know, some animals will take advantage of this. So in Africa, there's a bird called a drongo that will mimic the screams of hawks or the alarm calls of other birds towards hawks, which meerkats will use as signals. And the bird will fake out the meerkats to get them to drop, like, whatever prey they've got so the bird can come down and steal it. But it's kind of like the boy who cried wolf, right? It only works a certain number of times before the meerkats get wise that they've been duped. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. All right, thanks, folks. We appreciate it. We'll see you.